And indeed, it's this story of this very long script. It's a kind of a very strange thing, because I've been, recording for many, many years these conversations, and I've been, rather rarely been writing. I sort of wrote maybe 2 or 3 texts a year, but never really long. And all of a sudden, and it's something which really starts to tackle my great hero, the oral historian, American writer, once told me. There's a certain moment, when one records many, many, many conversations, and now at a certain moment, maybe, it can then become writing. And somehow, in a very weird way, I kind of couldn't stop writing this summer. So as Francesca said, there's this very long script. And what we're going to hear tonight is a kind of an improvisation, because it's not only an edit of this long script, but it's also an improvisation in terms of images, because I literally come just out of this writing, process, and it somehow was prompted really by this idea that I thought it somehow would be urgent to write down some thoughts about curating, and maybe also the history of curating, because obviously this word, when I started to be a curator or wanted to be a curator as a student and organized my first exhibition in my kitchen, lasted 3 months in my kitchen in St. Gallen, had 29 visitors. And I told my parents, I want to be a curator. They thought it's a medical profession. It was at that time a very, very, rarely used word. And it's kind of interesting how much that has changed. A recent article in the food section of the New York main newspaper, I have to apologize if it's going to be maybe a bit fast, because I never learned to speak slowly. It's ultimately been one of the reasons for my language exile, because I was also in Switzerland, I should go to Germany or Italy or Austria or France if I speak so fast. And so in any case, I will make an effort to not make it too fast. But the thing which is interesting is that, the word curating is really used the use of it has exponentially grown. A recent article in the food section of New York's main newspaper contained the following passage. A museum Chinatown feels that way at times if you're ducking under the lintel of a basement entrance like Wo Hops or Hop Key to find Cantonese crab or lobster. Sometimes the museum gets an energetic new curator like Wilson Tang, who has made the dim sum standards like Cha Siu Bao and Chong Fun noodles at his family's Nom Va Te parlor dance again. A clothing retailer sells a brightly colored style of trousers called the Curator Pant, while a brand called Curated promises a new experience in retail design. A museum brochure invites members to curate your own membership. Musicians and DJs are asked to curate music festivals, radio shows and playlists. Hotels, decor schemes and book collections are listed as curated by stylists. A celebrity chef is described as the curator of the food trucks in New York's High Park. Social media strategists speak of curated and aggregated content. A panel discussion comparing the merits of humans and computer algorithms describes how the war of humans versus machines has hit the battlefield of online video curation. A blog entitled How to Build Your Community with Content Curation advises business owners on curating content for your business blog and social media channels. Furthermore, the sociologist Mike Davis criticized Barack Obama by describing him as the chief curator of the Bush legacy. The president of a chain of housewares says we act as a curator, scoring the world for what we refer to as the best on planet products. Writing about his poker travails, his poker works, Colson Whitehead reports, I wasn't depressed, I was curating despair. It's a fairly obvious, actually, that curating is being used in a greater variety of contexts than ever before, in reference to everything from an exhibition of prints by old masters to the contents of a boutique wine shop. Of late, this point has been repetitively made in newspapers and magazines. Even the verb form so commonly used today, to curate, and its variants, curating, curated, are coinages of the 20th century. The records a shift in understanding from a person, a curator, to an enterprise curating, which is now understood as an activity unto itself. There is currently a certain resonance between the idea of curating and the contemporary idea of the creative self, floating freely through the world, making aesthetic choices of where to go and what to eat, to wear, and so on. The current vogue for the idea of curating stems from a feature of modern life that is impossible to ignore: the proliferation and reproduction of ideas, of information, of images, of disciplinary knowledge and material products that we are witnessing today. This is hard to overstate, But though the explosive effects of the internet are today very obvious, they are only the leading edge of a larger change that has been occurring for more than 100 years. The exponential increase in the amount of data human societies is a basic fact of our time. There is no type of information, if it's documents or books or images or videos, that is declining, which everyone recognizes. But in addition, we also create more material goods each year than the previous one. Today we are awash in cheaply produced objects to a degree that would have been difficult to imagine a century ago. The result, arguably, has been a shift in the ratio of importance between making new objects and choosing from what is already there. This contemporary resonance, however, risks producing a kind of speculative bubble in the value attached to the idea of curating and has to be resisted. The idea that most people today act as curators of experience and information does not mean that curating is inherently interesting or that curating is inherently valuable. Defining how and when curating becomes interesting or valuable is a separate, maybe more critical question. Here I can only speak of curating as a profession with a very specific history and touch on moments in that history of curating and exhibition making where it's actually a toolbox, where it can be a toolbox for the future. Dialogues between artists and places, between audiences and exhibitions are thrillingly catalyzed by the forces of globalization. There is an amazing potential for new encounters among today's fast proliferating array of art centers, yet homogenization is a danger too, as Edouard Glissant has pointed out. For Glissant, the idea of global dialogue is an enormous potential we have today, but as he points out, it always means to engage in a global dialogue, not to annihilate differences, but to produce differences. And maybe that could lead us to the first images. I kind of thought somehow tonight to talk about two of my toolboxes. I mean, in my sort of curating history, there's obviously many curators who have inspired me. If it's Walter Hobbs, if it's Pontus Sultan, it's a very specific history which goes back to Samperk, goes back to Alexander Dorner. It's a history which in big part, is still not written or is only written in fragments. However, I think it's kind of fascinating that inspiration can very often come where we expect it least, that it can actually come from very sort of unexpected sources. And for me, it very much has been actually the writing of Edouard Glissant, the writer of Martinique, who lived and worked a lot between France and New York, who has been a great inspiration and almost like, a daily reading. I've been reading him non-stop over the last 20 years every day. And his sort of ideas, we've just been discussing earlier tonight with Amar Kanwar and with Francesca and Daniela about the importance actually, Glissant has for him, is so important for many artists. I was thinking tonight, because really every single exhibition I've ever done had to do with Glissant, was inspired by Glissant, and his writings are still not translated into German, and only very few books, 3 or 4 books are translated to German, not into English. And I think, he is for our time, but maybe Foucault or Deleuze were for previous time very much a sort of a toolbox for practice. So I think to talk about Glissant is urgent. And one of the things I picked out from these 9 hours, thinking they might be urgent to squeeze into the 45 minutes tonight. I think that in some kind of way, Glissant, as the inventor of a very beautiful conceptual museum in Martinique, here you see sketches and drawings by him, wanted actually to produce an exhibition as an archipelago. He very much, here you see the Caribbean archipelago in one of his drawings, was mentioning that the archipelago is for him the sort of form or format of an exhibition and a museum for the 21st century. For him, an archipelago geography has no center, but consists of a series of different islands and cultures in which the exchanges that take place between them actually constitute their identity. Thinking, wrote Glissant, can too often be continental, rock-solid and imposing, rather than an archipelago which is welcoming and sheltering. Glissant explored many different possibilities actually for responding to the homogenizing forces of our time, and we can answer, in his view, actually these homogenizing forces by retiring into completely local contexts, which for him was a very limiting thing, or we can embrace these global forces, which is also very limiting because it then sort of exposes us to these homogenized forces. So he proclaimed this idea of mondialité, which for him is a global dialogue. It's actually a global dialogue which augments rather than homogenizes differences. Mondialité then meant for him the attempt to move through this world of ours without reducing it in all its plenitude to a single culture. And that's somehow interesting, because for the curator in the world that has moved beyond the authority of a few metropolitan centers, this is a most defensible credo. No? Glissant's own language, his native Creole, was formed from a combination of the languages of the French colonial rulers and also African slaves, and contains elements of both, but is itself something independent and unexpectedly new. In 1981, Glissant wrote a manifesto for continual fusion. It's a great, great book called Le Discours Antillais, and there he writes, creolization is a process which never stops. And he then goes on mentioning why he really believes that the archipelago is what we can learn from, that the archipelago, rather than the continents, are the kind of 21st century format. Here, from an interview I did with him, Glissant said the American archipelagos are extremely important because it was in these islands that the idea of creolization, that is the blend of cultures, was most brilliantly fulfilled. Continents reject mixings, whereas archipelagic thought makes it possible to say that neither each person's identity nor a collective identity are fixed and established once and for all. I can change through exchange with the other without losing or deluding my sense of self. I can change through exchange with the other without losing or deluding my sense of the self. And I think that very much is an extremely useful toolbox. Here are some more drawings of Glissant, which happened, during our conversations, all trying to explain the idea of the archipelago, and also the idea of his institute, Tout Monde. I mean, what is so interesting about Glissant is that he has been inventing an art institution for the 21st century, an art institution which was unrealized because the politics in Martinique did not allow it to happen, for which he worked with artists, involving Wilfredo Lam, Mata, artists of his own generation. And it's an enormous reservoir of ideas we can find today to actually think about exhibition. So in some kind of way, I think this idea of the toolbox and the idea also of sort of a reservoir of curatorial ideas is really the purpose of this kind of whole research. And as Panofsky said, very often if we want to invent the future, we invent it with fragments from the past. Here another archipelago drawing of Glissant on the right. Now we wanted to go to this video, but it's now gone. I told you it's an improvisation. Another toolbox I wanted to talk about tonight, which is not from the art world, was probably for me the second curator who was really a reason why I started to make shows and curate exhibitions, is the Russian impresario Sergei Diaghilev. He is the founder of the Ballet Russe. Before that, he studied law, became a critic and aesthete, started a magazine called The World of the Art in 1898, and after the magazine folded, began to curate large exhibitions under the same title. His interest was in comprehensiveness. At the Torrid Palace, for example, he curated a show of over 4,000 portraits by Russian painters. Much of his activity was based somehow on an overwhelming capacity for socializing and friendship. Through curating, he rapidly made contact with the luminaries of art, literature, and music, and retained many of these, friends for life. Out of this ferment, he was able to make a parallel move from curating of exhibitions. It was mostly exhibition of paintings in the early, part of his life, paintings and portraits, and then transported this experience of curating into time, into the field of dance. Like somehow another, pioneer about whom we could talk, whom I studied a lot, Félix Fénéan, who was another, inspiration for me for many exhibitions in the early 90s. Diaghilev was a holistic approach to the arts that underwent many shifts over his lifetime. And like Fainéant, he has always been one of, the sort of inexhaustible inspirations, because in the sort of, not even 20 years of his sort of activity, a very feverish series of productions did occur. Interesting is that Diaghilev took a long time actually before coming to the ballet. His greatest legacy, of course, where he created through the Ballet Russe a high cultural sensation in his time. In 1906, he curated a show of modern Russian art, which traveled through Europe, and he made his first trip to Paris. He then became fascinated by opera and ballet, seeing them as a modern form of Gesamtkunstwerk. He was from the very beginning interested in actually finding a way how to integrate the arts. Although ballet had reached a very high point in 19th century in Russia, it was not yet a highly celebrated art form, and Diaghilev poured his energies into promoting it from 1909, when he founded the Ballet Russe, producing 20 seasons amidst wars, crises, and social turmoil, until his very early death in 1929. Often beginning a new season with no money in his pocket, he was a master of cajoling and catching investment from every quarter, spending heedlessly and lavishly to realize his grandiose ambitions. He introduced the short format, half-hour ballet, and began the practice of commissioning major composers to write original works for it. He also provided a major stimulus to the art of choreography by demanding innovation. Diaghilev turned commissioning new works of art into a recognizable form of producing reality, hugely expanding the scope of ballet by inviting the greatest artists, composers, dancers, and choreographers of his time to collaborate on the extraordinary ballets his company produced. His work had a double scope. On the one hand, he brought the best international artists to the Russian stage. On the other, he brought the Russian avant-garde to the attention of the larger Western world, both by curating early in his life these exhibitions I mentioned, but by then, of course, doing these amazing global tours of the Ballet Russe, which resonate until today. Most of all, and he and his ballets were the toast and sensation of, fashionable artistic Paris, his production had a very reverse aspect on other artistic movements. For example, Fauvist painting is often understood to have been influenced by his productions and by the use of color in his incredible production. So the idea really was, if it's Stravinsky, if it's Picasso, if it's all the Russian avant-gardes, to pool all these amazing practitioners into one kind of time-based Gesamtkunstwerk. In his time, Diaghilev was the most famous theatrical producer alive, and yet his works exceeds any description that limits his influence to the theater or dance. As his biographer Xiang Sheyan has written, and I recommend very much his amazing biography Sheyan has written on Diaghilev, the labels customarily attached to him, those of impresario and patron, fail to do justice to the powerful influence he exerted on the arts in the early part of the 20th century. His goal of developing his own variant of the Wagnerian Gesamtkunstwerk without ever really producing creative work of his own makes it difficult to place him or assess the value of his achievements. Was he the prototype of the contemporary conceptual artist? Is the question Xiang asked. One could obviously ask as well if he was the prototype of what a century later would be called the curator. Diaghilev was a completely transdisciplinary way of curating. Also, it was actually at that time not recognized by that name. He was first and foremost a collector of artistic sensibilities, befriending a young Pablo Picasso and collaborating with Georges Braque and Natalia Goncharova. His mentors and advisors included literary giants such as Oscar Wilde, and he invited Anton Chekhov to edit a literary journal. In music, he promoted and worked with Stravinsky, whom he commissioned to write Le Sacré du Printemps, Prokofiev and Debussy, among many others, and in dance, he worked with such towering figures as Nijinsky and Balanchine. He also commissioned Coco Chanel to make costumes for him. For Diaghilev, the artistic world was promiscuous. His work brought together the giants of each contemporary field in order to create unexpected productions, unexpected encounters. So each time, a sort of a surprise in the encounter. I think that's also why he, in conversation with Cocteau, they coined this fabulous term of the étonnement, that it's always, full of surprise. Now, why Diaghilev a toolbox. One of the things Philippe Parreno and I, ever since the artist Philippe Parreno and I, ever since we spoke, in the late 90s, early 2000s, about this idea how one could actually bring more time into exhibitions, into group shows, because obviously into exhibitions, artists have done this for a long, long time, but how could one actually do group shows where artists would not be given space? Because normally, if you do a group show, you give an artist, space and not time. So what would happen if all of a sudden one would give an artist time? It was then on January the 1st, 2000, I was speaking with Matthew Barney, and I mean, that's probably, a second thing I'd like to emphasize as part of the methodology. If I talk about toolboxes, there's the curatorial history, there are these unexpected sources like Diaghilev or Glissant, but in the center of it all are always artists, that everything, comes always out of very, very close conversations with artists. And so, speaking, for example, to Matthew Barney on January the 1st, 2000, Matthew, after having done all these Cremaster films, expressed a kind of a strong desire for a live experience. He felt that in the new decade, new millennium, it would be urgent to explore a live experience. And Philippe Parreno, who ever since the early 90s, late 80s, had explored, idea of time in exhibitions, he used this notion of facteur temps, postman time, very early on. The same week pointed out to me that actually visual art ordinarily does not dictate the time a visitor must stand in front of it. In fact, this is kind of one of the defining characteristics of art in museums and galleries. They allow the visitors to have control over their time. They can stand in front of Manet's Déjeuner sur l'herbe for 10 seconds or 2 hours, making their own judgment as how long the painting deserves their attention or not. Rarely does visual art behave in the way actually theater does, by dictating time. An exhibition that functions in this way would expand the ways in which visual art has historically been understood. A time-bound visual group exhibition would in effect be a new experience. So we kind of thought it would be very interesting to explore that. And again, Diaghilev was the inspiration. What would happen if all of a sudden we would give the artists time? Over several years of conversation with Parreno, we discussed this idea and how one could actually come up with a rule of the game. And obviously the thing fell between the stools, because whenever we spoke to an opera or to a theater, they said, we are not doing art shows, we cannot do such a big production. And whenever we would speak to a museum, the museum wouldn't have a theater or a production of an opera scale and couldn't do it. So it needed really a new structure, it needed a new festival, which is the Manchester International Festival. And it's an extremely interesting story, which is maybe also interesting for, other cities as well. I think other cities could maybe learn from Manchester, because the mayor of Manchester made this very interesting move a couple of years ago, that he appointed the great Peter Saville artistic director of the city of Manchester. So basically, he gave an artist the keys to the city, and he really asked his artist, and designer Peter Saville, who had been so instrumental in putting Manchester on the map, during the Hacienda years, etc., how Manchester could be reinvented with something which would have, as Manchester has always had, a very strong focus on music, however, would then address the other discipline. Peter Saville, as an artist, and it really worked so well, came up with this idea that it would be very urgent to get a young festival director, and he found for Manchester the amazing Alex Poots, who would be a great music impresario, but who would then from there go into the other, disciplines. And what really happened was that that Manchester all of a sudden had a festival where things could happen which couldn't happen elsewhere. And that suddenly became a very special thing, because world premieres, which could happen in no other institution, suddenly could happen in Manchester. So it became a festival where projects like ours, which are kind of unrealized projects, which otherwise fall between the stools, can all of a sudden happen. So the idea was that actually we started to develop with artists a score for the evening. The idea would be that it's like an opera or an exhibition, where the score would somehow be then, it could be replayed. And that's another thing which is maybe interesting, because if one thinks about curating, the whole curating history, obviously has to do with exhibitions which happened once or happened twice, and then at a certain moment they disappear, and it's very, very difficult to reconstitute them. I mean, would be a whole other lecture to talk about this whole idea of restaging an exhibition, what's happening right now in the Prada Foundation, where Rem Koolhaas, Thomas Demand, and Germano Celan joined forces to revisit Harald Seemann's Historic When Attitudes Become Form. Now, obviously, it's interesting that if you look at Diaghilev's productions, for his centenary, they were all played again. So they enter a canon. There is a possibility to restage them, to replay them, and it's something I've always been very interested already. With Do It, when we wrote scores and instructions, and ask artists to basically contribute these scores so that the exhibition can be reinterpreted, and it's happened now in about 120 cities all over the world. And it's each time like a musical piece, a different interpretation of that Do It piece. So that was obviously the second part. We wanted to sort of have a group show as a score, which could then go from the Manchester Opera House into other cities. Sort of a very polyphonic situation, which would continue to change to the last minute. And it was kind of fascinating because Liam Gillick's piece opened the show and recorded each of its intervals. So basically, it's a player piano on stage which plays a song, but rather than a perfect piece of sheet music, the piano source music was a transcription of Gillick's imperfect attempt to play from memory a Portuguese revolutionary song that he had heard once, long before, at the birthday of a friend. Very much in the spirit of investigating the time-bound questions of duration, repetition, and originality, Gillick's piece was playing with the distinction between the live, with all its mistakes, and the mechanically reproduced with all its perfection. So basically, that sort of marked the beginning of it, but then this piece, also whenever something went wrong, when all of a sudden the curtain wouldn't open, or whatever, we would immediately play Liam's piece. So it was a piece which happened always in the interstices and could pop up again and again. At the same time, we had the introduction by Philippe Pareno, which is the kind of wall text we wrote, because obviously as curators of the show we would always write the wall text, but where can you put the wall text when the exhibition happens on stage? So Philippe came up with this wonderful idea that a ventriloquist would actually at the beginning present the sort of manifesto of the exhibition as a wall text, and from then on the opera would unfold. So maybe we can look here at some of it. By the way, the website we made is designed by the Dutch designers Metahaven.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to Il Tempo del Tostino. I am Jay Johnson, the ringmaster. Perhaps I am the living caption to an imaginary museum. I would like to introduce you to some out-of-focus ideas, and I will do so without moving my mouth. This will remind us all of Jacques Lacan's question, but who speaks? This is not a recording. Listen. Cedric Price was an architect who had the idea to build a museum in the time it takes to drink a cup of coffee. None of the artists here tonight were around when he started working on his Fun Palace, a complex for cultural presentations. The Fun Palace would have been perfect for us this evening. Cedric thought about time as much as he thought about space. You see, to him, time was the fourth dimension of design. He proposed urban interventions not as an addition of objects, but as time-based, adaptable interventions. The Fun Palace would have been a flexible structure. Buildings would have disappeared and other structures fall into their place. He designed an airport on wheels so it could move according to the wind. He also designed a bird cage that could move in the direction that the bird wanted to fly. Francis Picabia said, "We have a round head so that we can think in many directions." This is a group exhibition. The history of art is the history of objects, but exhibitions have their history too. El Tiempo del Tostino means postman time in English. In French, Tostino has two meanings. Facteur, which is a mathematical operation, and postman, which is a person who delivers information. 17 artists have a proposition for you tonight. You have just heard the day before the closure of the experimental factory, Liam Gillick's attempt to play La Grandola de la Marina by memory on the piano. The song used to signal the 1974 Portuguese Revolution, a tune as a signal, a link between time and action. This is your chance to visit an exhibition without moving, a journey without moving. Each artist in sequence, not side by side. This is Il Tempo del Tostino.
Maybe switch the sound off to tell a little bit more about the show. So it basically then continued, with Carsten Höller's experiment, followed also by Tino Segal, and where the orchestra played a symphonic arrangement of Aerodynamic, a song by Daft Punk, the French electronic musicians, and the curtain actually, danced according to this music, which was achieved by two dancers who, like puppeteers, skillfully manipulated the chords which control the curtain's rise and fall. David Adjaye wanted to create an episode of silence. She paid homage to one of the 20th century's most famous compositions, John Cage's 4 minutes 33, in which no music is played, Dean filmed Merce Cunningham for the 4-minute 33-second duration of Cage's piece. The elderly Cunningham, an explosive and kinetic choreographer and dancer, simply sat still, shifting position slightly for each of the composition's 3 movements. It echoed the power of Cage's silent piece of music. Dean's film was projected onto a screen on the stage, such as Cunningham's image appeared the same size as the audience watching him. He could be the ghost of our event, maybe, somehow. Matthew Barney produced a collision of narratives from Celtic and Egyptian myth, drawn from his own Cremaster series of films. For Barney, the project was a chance to restore the productive failures the filmmaking process is designed to edit out. In the course of editing, he said, you remove the failure, which in a way takes away something that was very magical. Everything that happens in post-production that kind of kills that moment. The difficulty and the beauty of a live work for him had to do with his inability to remove such moments of failure. During the intermission, Barney had a group of musicians dressed as military personnel marching through the foyer, and then the theater ending up on the stage. They carried a young girl on a stretcher. The orchestra played a score created by Jonathan Bepler, Barney's close collaborator. The house lights remained on. The girl was deposited on top of a dilapidated car, while a tableau of dancers in Egyptian costume and guards in New York City sanitation uniforms attended the scene. A live Scottish bull was present, lending a Celtic aspect to the proceedings, but also a symbol of Egyptian rites. Barney himself played a funeral prince, wearing on his head a basket containing a small Egyptian dog. In Trisha Donnelly's sequence, an African opera singer took the stage and sang a song to the beat of a drum played by Donnelly herself in the wings. After a flash, the screen filled with an image of Gary Cooper, and the orchestra shouted, Gary Cooper. The song resumes for massive black objects fall from the ceiling, and the orchestra began humming, smoke and dark shaped below. Reke Tiravanija created a puppet show of ventriloquists, puppets sitting on the lap of 3 sisters, who sang as the puppets mouthed the lyrics. Ku Shonga's piece was the shortest in time. In very dim light, the curtains opened to reveal a very large tree on stage, its leaves rustling in a faint breeze. After 1 minute, the curtains closed and the piece began. The sheer variety of the different works was somehow the aim. It was not linear, and such experiments are not picked up the next day, but they kind of hopefully sink in. So the idea really was that it somehow had maybe to do with an experiment which then could be repeated. And 2 years after Manchester, sort of score was replayed in Basel. And in some kind of way, that question of that live momentum, moving away actually from the idea of art as a production of material object, was something which for the first time became clear to me when as a teenager I met in Switzerland Eugenie Ionesco, and it was a very strange encounter. So that here we have another, a third kind of unexpected influence on curators. Diaghilev, we have, the 2 examples I mentioned before, and then we have Ionesco. And with Ionesco, he was very old, obviously, as had stopped writing plays, and he came to St. Gallen in Switzerland to do, etchings, etchings. And he, they're almost like children drawings. It's at the end of his life, one of the great playwrights, and he at that time was much more famous than now. I mean, it was somehow, him and Beckett were the 2 sort of great playwrights of that moment. And but he had stopped writing plays and did these drawings. So we had a coffee, and it was one of the first artists I ever met. And it was very, very strange because he said that evening when we had a coffee in St. Gallen, at that very moment, La Cantatrice Chauve, the bold singer, would be performed in Paris. And he said it had been performed every single night for the last 35 years. I suppose now it's 50 years, right? So he says you've got to understand this piece is kind of more permanent than many sculptures of marble, which get removed after a couple of decades. And so for me it was a real epiphany, of his idea that another form of duration is possible, and also this idea of it almost like a play being a kind of what Gilbert and George would call a living sculpture. Now, the reason why I thought it would be interesting tonight to, out of all of these possible routes one could talk about, because obviously, in answer to this ever increased use of the word curating, I think it becomes very urgent to look into the history. It looks very interesting to sort of, I mean, it is a fairly new profession. It combines a lot of activities into one role, but it somehow has also, a longer history than one thinks. I mean, the other day somebody told me curating started with Harald Seemann, and with my deep respect for Harald Seemann as my childhood, mentor, there's obviously a much longer history than that. And in ancient Rome, curatores were civil servants who took care of some rather prosaic, if necessary, functions. They were responsible for overseeing public works, including the aqueducts and the sewers. In the medieval period, the focus shifted to a more metaphysical aspects of human life. The curatus was a priest who took care of the souls of a parish. By the late 18th century, curator came to signify the task of looking after a museum's collection. And that brings us already closer to what it is now. Different kinds of caretaking, from the Latin curare, to take care of, came to signify the task maybe of looking after a museum's collection. So different kinds of caretaking have sprung from this root over the centuries. But the work of the contemporary curator remains, I think, surprisingly close to curare in the sense of cultivating, growing, pruning, trying to help people and their kind of shared context to thrive. So in parallel, we can say that the professional curator's role began to coalesce around four functions. No? The first was preservation. Art had come to be understood as a crucial part of a heritage, a set of artifacts that collectively told the story of a country or of a place. So that safeguarding this heritage became certainly a responsibility of the curator. The second task was the selection of new work. As time passes, collections must necessarily be added to, and the caretaker of the museum becomes the caretaker of a legacy, which in this sense the institution represents. The third would be the task of contributing to art history, so scholarly research into the works already collected allowed the curator to produce knowledge in modern disciplinary fashion, in the same mode as the university professor maybe. Finally, last but not least, there is the task of displaying and arranging the art on the wall of the galleries, the making of exhibition. This is the task that has certainly most come to define the contemporary practice. One could even argue that a neologism is maybe needed, because so completely has the curator as Ausstellungsmacher or exhibition maker departed from the traditional role of caretaking, that actually somehow, a neologism does become necessary. One could talk definitely, much more about his history. But the reason why, when Daniela told me we can't do 9 hours, I thought it would be interesting tonight, to focus on this time-based aspect of curating and tell you a little bit about Tempo del Postino, and maybe now also in the next part about the marathon, is that I thought it would be interesting in the context here, particularly also talking to Boris and Daniela about the program which is happening here, thinking about the fact that after this speech we're going to have a time-based piece by Hassan Khan, given the fact that many other artists have done time-based pieces here, that this is an experiment with time in this garden, given the fact that we have a wonderful park connection, because I'm the co-director of the Serpentine Gallery in London, and there are not that many museums and exhibition venues which are in a park. It's actually, we were counting them the other day, and there are very, very few in the world actually who have this sort of incredible privilege of having a park connection. So I thought for all these reasons, it could be interesting to somehow focus on that time, based aspect. And for me, it was very interesting sort of moving, to London in 2006 and starting as the co-director of the Serpentine with Julia Peyton-Johns. It wasn't my first, experience in London. I had lived there in the 90s, and Julia had invited me to do an exhibition called Take Me, I'm Yours, where artists made works that visitors could, interact with, and it was a show very inspired by Felix González Torres. And ever since, the dialogue with Julia had continued. In 2006, we decided to actually think about this idea of running an arts organization together. As Julia said, 1 + 1 can be 11, and also the idea that the complexity of the 21st century art institution makes it, somehow interesting that two people, share this idea of running an art institution. It's also more fun. So from this point onwards, we started to think, how could we combine the different aspects? And Julia had come up in 2000 with this amazing idea to actually build a pavilion. And that's again an interesting connection, because obviously Francesca has commissioned as well for a long time architecture. We are sitting here in one of it, in a temporary structure, which is at the same time functional, or Cedric Price would say it's both functional and it's also a garden folly, as he would have called it, in terms of distortion of space and time. Or if you think also about, the architectures Francesca did in Lockwood and many other places, in Venice, these temporary architecture. So Julia Peyton-John started in 2000 with Zaha Hadid with this idea of a pavilion, and the idea was really to have every summer a architectural structure in front of the Serpentine. And it's a kind of idea like when you have an institution, after a certain time, the risk is always that it freezes and then becomes somehow repetitive, and routine is the enemy of every exhibition. And so the kind of thing is, how can one always keep that spirit of reinvention? And very rarely an exhibition venue gets a new wing and expands, and then it's a moment of extreme excitement. We are having that as well at the moment, because we're going to open this second permanent space in Kensington Gardens by Zaha Hadid, the Serpentine Sackler Gallery, in a few weeks. However, we have this every summer, because every summer there is this pavilion in front of the Serpentine which goes up. This summer it's by Sue Fujimoto. So Julia had invented this idea of a pavilion. I had started the year before to do these marathons, and it's kind of interesting because I was mentioning before how inspiration can come from such encounters, Ionesco or the work of Diaghilev. It can also happen if suddenly we go into another context. I found it fascinating because having brought in a lot of literature, music and architecture into the art world, I sort of increasingly started to be invited to also curate in this other world, to curate for science events, to curate for music festivals, to curate in literature museums and so on. And what happened in 2005 was very interesting, because an invitation came from the late Marit Zimmermann and Christine Peters to do something for a theater festival in Stuttgart on stage. And they said they wanted to stage my interview project, and we were thinking what we could do. And so I said, let's try 24 hours and just not go to sleep and see what happens. And we would interview for 24 hours 24 people in Stuttgart. And it was a rather difficult situation, because after about 19-20 hours I kind of partially lost the plot, and I don't really remember what I talked to the last 4 guests. It must have been sort of stream of consciousness talk. And it was also a rather lonely situation, because I kind of sat on stage, and then all these people went for dinner after having done the interview, and I had always to do the next interview. So it was not completely satisfactory. So I kind of, talked to Julia about this experience, and we thought we could combine it with the marathons, with the pavilions. And actually, we invited Rem Koolhaas to do the next pavilion in 2006. So I thought it would be great to somehow talk to Rem, and that leads us now to this unique situation that you actually develop the structure in which one speaks at the same time as one develops the idea and involves the architect in the idea, which is a very different situation than when you build a building and then have to inhabit it, and you're always too late, but you can actually define the building. So we had conversations with Rem and told him about this idea, and Rem came up with this idea of a sort of a speech bubble, because he said it's an architecture for conversation. You're going to have infinite conversations. So he really built the pavilion for us to have conversations. And luckily I was no longer alone, because Rem and I did these conversations together. And so it was like in a double situation that when I had a sort of a moment of lower energy, he would lead the interviews, and then I would lead the interviews, and so we weren't tired at all, and we did it for 24 hours. And we could also interview many more people. I have an idea, because the two of us, it had another pace, so we interviewed 72 Londoners, and it became this this sort of portrait of a city. And then, and it leads us back to Tempo del Postino. Olafur Eliasson arrived the next year in 2007, and you can see all of this on the website of the Serpentine, all these different marathons. In 2007, Olafur Eliasson did the pavilion together with Ketil Thorsen. Was more like a ramp. A fascinating thing is also that, and I don't know if that happens here, but that you never can predict how such structures are being used around the clock. So for example, our pavilions very often, they always are used early in the mornings by joggers. So with Olafur Eliasson, this sort of now Gabo-related sort of spiralesking ramp became a kind of a ramp for the joggers in the morning, and then people come and read their newspaper. It becomes a social space for gathering, and then the evening we do talk. So Olafur said, you've really talked enough the year before, because Rem and I talked non-stop. It's time to do something, to experiment. So. And he said also it would be really interesting, that this marathon is not just a talk show, because obviously, we could sort of do a talk show, and it sort of is one aspect of the marathon, that it's my talk show. However, it could be actually more interesting that it's a curated space, that it's somehow a group show. So he said the same thing really Philip said, you would give to the artists 15, 20 minutes, and they would do an experiment. And we did this 48-hour experiment with almost 100 artists, and it's actually at that time that was one of the many collaborations with Francesca. We worked with the pavilion of actually Matthew Ritchie, exactly, and Matthew Ritchie came, and Neil Turok, the quantum physicist, and we had a whole session on that. And then many artists did experiments in public. So it became somewhere a hybrid between a performance festival, a group show. It still had remnants of a conference. We weren't really sure. And it was very much a kind of, hopefully, new format. The year after, we thought it would be urgent to do manifestos, because somehow the question of manifestos, what are manifestos for the 21st century? And we obviously live nearby Speaker's Corner. The Serpentine is, I don't know if that exists in Vienna, but there is this amazing place called Speaker's Corner. I mean, it has now more shifted to the internet, but it played historically a very, very important role for free speech and, for people to deliver radical lectures and manifestos and denunciations and appeals and even rants, no? And so the idea was actually to use Speaker's Corner and to do a manifesto marathon. So we basically worked very closely with Eric Hobsbawm, the late Eric Hobsbawm, the historian, and many artists, and basically obviously also had a critique of manifestos. Tino Segal expressed big doubts during the marathon that manifestos are maybe masculine, are very 20th century, and maybe the 21st century is more of a conversation than a manifesto. Then we had the year after in Sejima Nishizawa's pavilion the marathon about poetry. We felt very urgent to kind of reconnect the art world more to poetry. It's something which has always existed in the historic avant-gardes in the 20th century and had maybe somehow gone a bit missing in our time. So the poetry marathon emerged, and the year after in the Peter Zumthor pavilion with Pete Udorf, we had the garden marathon about gardens of the 21st century, and started to more and more connect these topics also to technology. So basically, what's the garden on the internet? What's Zumthor's very physical garden? Same thing was true for the next year when we had the map marathon, where we worked with maps for the 21st century. When Kerith Wynne Evans did his very memorable performance with a piano in the Royal Geographic Society, and the late Richard Hamilton discussed the map of Palestine together with Eyal Weizmann. So it was all about maps for the 21st century. Now this year, this sort of digital aspect will become even more important, because we're doing actually the 89 plus marathon. It's a new project which Simon Castells and I started, which basically focuses on a new generation of artists. It's who are born in the age of digitization. Douglas Copeland refers to this generation as the diamond generation, in terms of any reference for sort of traditional notions of authorship and maybe heritage, something which is manifest in their work. So the idea also of instant knowledge and technological know-how at the fingertips, and also the sort of relying on digital platforms of showcasing new ideas, is all things which are part of that. And the idea really grew out of conversations we had with Ryan Trecartin, because Ryan Trecartin one day told us about a year ago that he believes that people born in the 90s, artists born in the 90s, are truly amazing. He just keeps encountering these amazing artists, and he really can't wait until they all start to make art and start to appear, more publicly. And in some kind of way, Ryan made us aware that we really know barely anybody born in 89 and younger. So we started this research. And 89 is obviously a very interesting sort of paradigm shifting year. If you think about the Berlin Wall, if you think about the post-Cold War period, about Tiananmen Square, etc., etc. So in many different ways, it obviously has to do also, with curating the future. So Simon and I have begun an investigation, charting many of these artists. We've got more than 1,000, dossiers so far, and the sort of the first findings of this global study were presented in an 8-person panel at the DLD in Munich in January this year. And since then, a sort of a continuous research has started. We receive recommendations daily from artists all over the world, and somehow it's an attempt really to discover, but to assist and hopefully also empower this generation, which crosses borders, and somehow also at the beginning maybe not do exhibitions but do more gatherings, and it very much follows this idea of what John Kenneth Galbraith always said when he said that change comes not from men and women changing their minds only, but from the change from one generation to the next. We are not yet sure if this is true, but we think it's kind of interesting to question if that change can be tracked, and if in addition, obviously, as always, and that leads us very back to the beginning of anything I've been doing. When I started to basically, I was always saying, I was born in May 68 in Zurich, so it was the right date, and it was the wrong city. There was no May 68 in Zurich. May 68 arrived 12 years late, only with the riots in 1980 in Zurich. But I was kind of reborn a second time in Zurich in May 85, and as a teenager, I met Fischli Weiss, and I made the first studio visit with them, and that was such an epiphany that I kind of thought I wanted to spend my life with art. And obviously the question was always what could be a utility, and I think that's the key question of our project, and we hope that with 89 Plus it will be a very useful tool, a tool for this generation, mainly also to meet and start to have more dialogues between the disciplines. And so we will have the structure of Zaha Hadid opening in September, the Serpent and Sackler Gallery. We have the pavilion of Sue Fujimoto, which I hope you can all see, which is in Kensington Garden until October. And during the Freeze weekend, between Sue Fujimoto's pavilion and the new Zaha Hadid structure, we have the 89 Plus marathon. Now this brings us almost to the end of this short lecture, and I would just like to show you one more thing. From the Tempo del Postino. Here we have Tacita, we have Doug Aitken, we have Pierre Weig.